May I start by offering my sincere thanks to the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism for this opportunity to talk to you. In this presentation, I want to do two things. One, to offer a synopsis of two key interventions that my book, Outcast, makes to wider academic debate. And two, to suggest some interlocutions of Outcast with other recent interventions on the nature of racism and the anti-racist imagination. The first intervention is in the field of ethnic and racial studies. I first read the Routledge Key Ideas book, Racism, by the sociologist Robert Miles as an undergraduate student in the mid-1990s. In this first edition text, published in 1989, Miles makes a critical observation. Much of the British and North American theorising about capitalism and racism since the 1960s, while drawing upon the immoral status of racism, which derives to a significant degree from the final solution, utilises a colonial model which has little scope to explain much of the European racism of the 19th and 20th centuries, and certainly not that form of racism which others label anti-Semitism. It does, however, have a relevance to the controversial debate about whether or not Zionism can be defined as an instance of racism. A major contribution of Robert Miles's research to the study of race and racism is his critique of a dominant body of academic work that sees the origins of racism exclusively in colonialism, one consequence of which is a conceptual deflation of racism to that of a white ideology created exclusively to dominate black people. This approach to racism is shown to have emerged from the rise of the civil rights movement and the increasing scale and intensity of political struggles of African American people against racist oppression and inequality in the United States during the 1960s. Since the 1960s, this US approach has significantly influenced British academic thought on race and racism. So even though racism was central to the rise of fascism in Western Europe during the 1930s, the concept of racism since 1945 has evolved and been largely shaped by a need to comprehend colonialism, either in a post-colonial situation or in the context of migration from the ex-colonies into Western European countries. British academic research has produced theories of racism that are so specific to the history of colonialism that they have limited ability to explain any other context, with much theorising transposing the dual camp of coloniser and colonised into white versus black, thus further limiting the explanatory power of the concept of racism. Through a colonial model of racism and a deflated concept of racism, the anti-racist imagination continues rather than challenges racialised essentialism. That is, the idea that humankind consists of people of different races with different intrinsic dispositions, and locks us into a dualistic struggle and structural bind of race relations. The problem, put simply, is that, I quote, there are no races and therefore no race relations. Instead of exploring how the idea of race intersects with capitalist social relations, race is assumed to be functional to capitalism and to form a fixed and over-totalised structure of oppression. On the face of it, work that seeks to expose the stratified race relations of colonialism, imperialism and capitalism has the weight of being politically progressive. After all, by linking capitalism and racism functionally and causally, capitalism can be damned for yet another reason. The problem here is the rarefication of the idea of race, that is, race is made real, rather than understanding that it is the idea of race which has reality, and that needs to be explained as emerging from and shaped by fluid conditions and forces of existence. It's worth noting that Paul Gilroy, while distancing himself from Miles's work, later arrives at a similar position to him. In Gilroy's seminal paper, Race Ends Here, from 1998, he argues for a more consistent effort to denature and deontologise race. This change of course is all the more important, he recognises, because the memory of Nazi genocide has ceased to form the constellation under which we strive to do critical work in this area. In other words, by making race real, the lens of what is racism in critical research on race no longer sees anti-Semitism. So, primarily drawing on the work of Robert Miles alongside the scholarship of George Mosser, in Outcast I offer a holistic overview of the prehistory and history of racism that reintegrates anti-Jewish racism as an ideological component of racism. Indeed, a central and consistent ideological component from the mid-19th century onwards, which drew from and reworked much earlier representations of the Jewish other. From this history, a number of important points come to light. While colonialism was an integral moment in the history of racism, it was actually the articulation between the capitalist mode of production and the nation state, rather than between capitalism and colonialism, that mapped the primary set of social relations within which racism had its origins and initial effects. The racist imagination does not require skin colour as a marker of signification to the existence of harmful races, because people do not see race. Rather, they observe certain combinations of real and sometimes imagined somatic and cultural characteristics to which they attribute meaning with the idea of race. Indeed, as the French academic Colette Goulimen shows, along with the apparent physical characteristics of different racial groups, during the first half of the 19th century, other racial denominators that were social and cultural traits began to emerge. So from philological research, for example, the identification of different language groups very quickly became part of the racial systems of somatic classification. It was a short step from here to the idea of Indo-European and Semitic races. And as George Mosser notes, it became usual in anti-Semitic works for Jews to speak a mixture of German and Yiddish, a jargon from which not even a Rothschild could escape. The linguistic abilities of African Negroes were treated with similar contempt. Through a colonial model of racism and the rarefication of race and skin colour, academics focusing on the negative racialisation of somatic difference exclusively only see some forms of racism. However, when the racist imagination classifies race, the indicators chosen are matters of politics rather than objective reality, as illustrated by the Nazis deciding who was and who was not a Jew. Racist classification is based on social imagination and political decision-making, not real innate differences between human beings. Now, if the colonial model of racism and its white over black dualism renders other forms of racism invisible, this model seems particularly ill-equipped to see racism that works on the very idea of the invisible enemy within. While the Jewish other has been racialised physically, this other has also been racialised as an invisible threat. The absence of visibility here has been used to the advantage of the racist imagination. The very fact, Miles tells us, the very fact that there are so few living Jews can become socially accepted as proof of either the real extent of Jewish power or the continued success of Jews in assimilating themselves, of hiding in order to continue their destructive work. A central idea that ricochets down the tunnel of anti-Jewish racist ideology is that of Jews as immoral capitalists who make money in devious ways, unlike the Aryans who make money by honest work. One prominent racial scientist claimed the following: the inferior races such as the yellow race and the Jews are without scruples and had no sense of values, being wholly commercial. Aryan commercial society lives by honest work. The Aryans care about the values with which they speculate, but the Jew loves speculation for its own sake. So this idea of the deceitful Jew, who exists in contrast to honest capitalism, arises also in the contribution to racism from English intellectuals. So For the Scottish racial scientist Robert Knox, author of Racism Man, the enemy was the Jew, who reflects, I quote, the distorted image of the bourgeoisie, cunning, scheming and usurious. This historical idea adds context to the Jew of contemporary anti-Jewish racism, who is an enemy of both the right and the left, as a free-thinking socialist poisoning hearts and minds, and as a cutthroat capitalist bleeding the workers to death, as Philip Cohen puts it. One final point I want to touch upon that arises from the history of racism I discuss in my book is how the ideas of race and nation, Miles and Brown state, were not so much identical as mutual reflections. Racism and nationalism are mutual reflections. From the non-national nation to the international nation, the idea of the Jews as the enemy within the nation and the enemy beyond the nation, plotting behind the scenes and living off immoral capitalism, is a critical and persistent ideological thread of anti-Jewish racism. The geography of the wandering Jew is central. The Jewish other who is a threat to the self cannot be geographically fixed and located even when there is a nation state of Jews, since this nation state is judged to be innately territorially hungry and expansive, capable of exceptional global control, and to be the global laboratory and globalisation of the world's ills. As such, the termination terminus Israel is prescribed. Both before and after Israel, Jews are a betrayal of the nation state and nationalism, and the essence of bad capitalism. From the enemy of the nation state to the enemy nation state, all the while representing the harms of capitalism, colonialism and imperialism. Indeed, as Philip Cohen remarks, as soon as wandering Jews began to put down roots, they became even more dangerous. Now it was the very tenaciousness of Jewish culture which is the threat. One intervention of Outcast then is into the study of race and racism to redress the banishment of Jewish people as victims of racism. And the other related intervention is in the field of post-colonial studies, since the banishment of Jewish people as victims of racism is a consequence of their demotion as racist pariahs. As Robert Fine and Glynis Cousin astutely observe, the ghost of Israel-Palestine haunts the current separatism between racism and anti-Semitism. To recap, the tendency of contemporary Anglo-American academic work on race and racism to bypass consideration of anti-Jewish racism can be seen as a consequence of the colonial model of racism. Emerging out of the political struggles of the African-American population in the 1960s, the colonial model places the origins of racism exclusively in the history of slavery and colonialism and conceptualises racism as the persistence of white structural power and dominance over black people. Now, the 1960s was significant also for the development of the New Left and the shift of much of the revolutionary left on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after Israel's expansionist victory in the June 1967 war, to a position of absolute hostility to Israel as a national entity. After 1967, for much of the left, Palestine has become the global symbolic vanguard of anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism and anti-racism. If the colonial model of racism emerging out of the 1960s exiled anti-Jewish racism and platformed Zionism as racism, then after 1967, the general circulation of anti-Jewish racist ideas gained traction in the leftist milieu and ignited the fire that exalts Zionism as the evil incarnate of imperialism, colonialism and racism. Crucially, during the 1960s and 1970s, the academy was the space for the intersection of this colonial model of racism and this new hostility to Israel. The success of Edward Said's Orientalism, a foundational text of post-colonial studies, reflects this. This book was written in response to the Western media portrayal of Arabs in the June 1967 war and was published in 1978, 1 year after the election for the first time of a right-wing government in Israel. Outcast is a challenge to the academic post-colonial left, specifically to an analysis of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that fuses a colonial model of racism with the Jewish question. The Jewish question being the representation of Jews as harmful to humanity. In his book, Confronting Anti-Semitism on the Left, Daniel Randall identifies and explores 3 historical strands to left anti-Semitism. 1, primitive anti-Semitism, in which capitalism is viewed and problematised as innately Jewish. 2, the conspiracy theories of the so-called communist bloc, from especially the 1950s, against the supposed secret cabal of cosmopolitan and Zionist Jews. And 3, a Stalinist anti-Zionism that frames Zionism, Jewish nationalism, as a transcendent force of imperialism, colonialism and racism. It seems likely that this Stalinist anti-Zionism shaped the general approach of the New Left to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict after 1967. Indeed, the independent Marxist scholar and Orientalist Maxine Rodinson, who features prominently in my book, by the way, cautions that Said's Orientalism is, I quote, a polemic against Orientalism written in a style that was a bit Stalinist, that is, in its dual camp delineation of the world into adversaries and allies, which here translates into colonial settler versus native, white versus black, harmful Jew versus Palestinian victim. The problem with this leftist dual camp is that it fetishizes and inverts the bourgeois dual camp of major imperialist powers who present geopolitical moments as a moral choice between civilization versus barbarism, good versus evil, and in this process it substitutes consideration of the politics of particular camps for the principle of my enemy's enemy is my friend. The task instead is to construct an alternative and independent force of political thought and action, by and for the interests of the working class, trade unionists, secularists, anti-racists, feminists, queer activists and so on, which can transcend socially constructed differences amid humankind, such as nationality, religion and race. The dual camp here is a cultural essentialisation of 2 camps of people. It's an identity politics, not a class politics. Within post-colonial studies, a distinction is drawn between colonialism and settler colonialism, with the former operating through a logic of exploitation and the latter through a logic of elimination. The settler colonialism paradigm is used to judge Israel-Palestine. Now, while this paradigm potentially opens up wide-ranging sites of comparison, Rachel Busbridge observes that in actuality there is a particularly strong emphasis on white European settler colonialism vis-a-vis Americas, Australasia and Israel-Palestine, to the omission of other settler colonial relationships like Russia, Chechnya or China, Tibet. An academic understanding of the world through a colonial model of racism, including Orientalism, explains this phenomenon. The story of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict fits, or is rather made to fit, a dualistic racialised schema. The story here is a simple story Aylan Pape tells us. It is a story of white people who were persecuted in Europe and who drove away the black people who used to live here. He continues, the villains present themselves as heroes. Those are the Israelis. They were and are servants of the bureaucracy of evil. They come quite innocent into the system, but only the very few among them do not succumb to its raison d'etre and modus operandi. Here explicitly, we have white Jews and black Palestinians racialised into culturally essentialist groups, with the Jews signified as the submissive lackeys of evil. The task Pape insists is to isolate, expose and revoke Israel as a pariah state. The takeaway message to Jews associated with Israel and Zionism is repent or be doomed. I demonstrate in my book how post-colonial academic criticism of Israel and Zionism is an essentialised and exceptionalised damnation. Such criticism is done through the lens of the Jewish question. What is to be done with a nation state guilty of an ethnic cleansing and racism on par with South African apartheid and Nazi Germany? What is to be done with Zionism's national racism that has even gone so far as to historically present itself as socialist? What is to be done with so-called left-wing Jews who failed to see the origins of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in 1948, not 1967? What is to be done with the Jews who have failed to learn their lesson from the Holocaust? What is to be done with an innate drive within Zionism and Zionist Jews to ethnically cleanse to the destiny of genocide? The conclusion to the Jewish question: undo Israel. The spatial and temporal aspects of a racialised construction of Zionism are notable. Zionism is spatially fluid, with a territorial hunger and global reach that knows no bounds, and temporarily frozen. On the temporal aspect, Joyce Dalsham astutely identifies a contradictory anachronism employed in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. Some people out of time arouse anger, revulsion and condemnation, while others inspire sympathy. Jewish territorial nationalism and Jewish settlers in the occupied territories are out of time, provoking denunciation. Palestinians as a national group cannot advance towards national liberation as they are trapped in a settler colonialism that is out of time, provoking pity. The answer to the Jewish question presents here is Jews must give up their national home to belong to civilization. What's interesting is that Palestinians too are racialized. Palestinians need to realise their national home to at last belong to civilization. The stage is cast in post-colonial analysis for the heroes and the villains, with no room for nuance. For example, on the one hand, there's no intellectual room to consider the Jewish settler who lives in the occupied territories because they cannot afford housing inside Israel, and who is open to coexisting with Palestinians in a liberated Palestine alongside Israel. On the other hand, there's no inclination to critically assess the reactionary politics and military tactics of Islamist resistance. The Jewish question in this literature outcasts Jews from the universal human collective, unless penitent of the sins of Israel and Zionism, and romanticize those in defiance of such Jews. The colonizers, Israeli Jews and Jewish settlers, are deemed to require, I quote, a radical psychological shift and deconstruction of a certain narcissism based on illusory identity, because colonialism creates monsters out of men. The colonized Palestinian Islamists are subalterns with legitimate reasons for rebelling against Israeli oppression. We may abhor their use of violence, but guess that it might disappear were they liberated. Both actors are essentialised and given innately negative, in the case of the Jews, or innately positive in the case of the Palestinians, consequences. One-state advocates within post-colonial academic work are unified in their attack on a separatist, essentialist, settler colonial political Zionism. However, any academic position that strays from the absolute polarity between settler and native is considered, as Busbridge states, assimilationist, or worse still, genocidal in effect, if not intent. Notably, a binational one-state solution, which is a minority position coming from within the body of post-colonial academic literature, is rejected and marginalised as an entrenchment and legitimisation of colonial relations, despite the plea of some to acknowledge the present reality of two national groups and to thus engage with the right claims of Jewish Israelis to alleviate the fears of expulsion in the eventuality of decolonisation. Anything less than the full unrecognising and undoing of the right of Jewish people to national self-determination is considered immoral and an anathema to genuine decolonisation. Virginia Tilley, for example, suggests that seeing a Palestinian people and a Jewish people in need of territorial self-determination is an unacceptable acceptance of an ethno-nationalism, which is aberrant, anachronistic and ruinous. Busbridge insightly observes that the absolutist solution of decolonisation is no solution at all, since a faithful adherence to the paradigm of settler colonialism renders decolonisation largely unachievable, if not impossible. Thus, she states, the conflict hurtles from the past to the present into the future, never to be fully extinguished until the native is, or until history itself ends. The story becomes one of either total victory or total failure, with a fantasy of a victorious one Palestinian state, making room for Jews as a neutral and repentant collectivity. The zero-sum game of post-colonial analysis of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict can only be understood through its Jewish question. While other nation states have come into existence through settler colonialism, these are assumed through the passage of time, fait accomplis. Two reasons are offered as to why Israel proper must not be considered a fait accompli. The first, Israel arrived too late in a world that has moved on to decolonisation. Here, the Jewish question presents as the Jewish nation state and the Jews associated with it are uniquely stuck in the past and are an outstanding impediment to human progress, thus belong to the dustbin of human history. The position of Tony Judt reflects this when he states, the problem with Israel is not, as sometimes is suggested, that it is a European enclave in the Arab world, but rather it arrived too late. The second reason, Zionism is seen as the globalising crucible of colonialism, imperialism, social dispossession, injustice and repression. Here the Jewish question presents as Israel and Zionism are the inventories, testers and exporters of global ills. As Veracini puts it, Palestine today is a crucial laboratory of global dispossessions prior to being transferred that is sold elsewhere. While one aspect of the Jewish question views Zionism as an outlier or latecomer in a post-colonial era, the other aspect sees Zionism as the present to future precedent for the ethnic cleansing and genocide of indigenous peoples worldwide. Again, quoting Veracini, expulsions are the present and the future. Zionism is not a latecomer, it is a precursor. One-state advocates of the settler colonialism paradigm thus regard themselves as part of a global decolonisation battle and struggle against Zionism. Palestine is hence accorded, in the words of Busbridge, a prophetic role in the global struggle against colonialism and imperialism. So Outcast shows how the post-colonial academic left approaches the Palestinian-Israeli conflict through a moralistic settler colonialism paradigm that sees Israel and Zionism as the ultimate historical vestiges or harbingers of colonialism, racism and genocide worldwide. This conflict is bound up with a global anti-racist struggle and project of decolonisation in which the priority enemy is Zionist racism. The settler colonial paradigm turns Zionism into a monster with an insatiable appetite for ethnic cleansing, who will stop at nothing up to and including genocide. The Palestinians are made into the victims and only the victims. The moral stains of the 20th century, the Holocaust and South African apartheid are brought together to reveal the Israel of the now 21st century as the worst of the worst nation states and settler colonialisms. The Zionist Jews are the contemporary Nazis. The Palestinians are the modern day victims of the concentration camps. Even when assessed under a seemingly wider comparative lens to other New World white settler societies, Israel still incongruently represents an exceptional harm to humanity, which demands undoing as a historical reality. In the words of Robert Fine and Philip Spencer, the othering of Jews inevitably creates an inequitable economy of compassion and a restrictive arena of solidarity. An inequitable economy of compassion and a restrictive arena of solidarity. In its spiritless radicalism, it at once turns Israel into the primary source of violence in the world and places Palestinians into a single identity script as victims, only as victims and only as victims of Israel. Just as it subsumes the plurality of Jewish voices to the Jews and the plurality of Israeli voices to Israel, it also subsumes the plurality of Palestinian voices to the Palestinians and risks turning them into ciphers of our own resentments. The tragedy of the post-colonial left approach is that it offers no way out for the Palestinians other than a zero-sum game, which itself is a dead end. The leftist imagination here sees Zionism as a particularly deplorable infliction on and obstacle to the progress of humanity, and operates zero tolerance for anything other than the dissolution of Israel, along with contrite, shame-faced Jews ready to denounce their collective Jewish identity. This is the Jewish question writ large. As a way out and a way forward in Outcast, I resuscitate a Marxist tradition to the Jewish collective and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict that is free from the Jewish question and which takes into account a historical context of European anti-Semitism, colonialism and nationalism. Notably, I excavate the work of the late independent Marxist scholar Maxine Rodinson as an exemplar of how the racist and colonial dimensions of Israel can be comprehended relatively without an absolute moral damnation of the Jewish collective or a moralistic resolve to destroy Israel. Recognising what Gilroy refers to as our overwhelming sameness, also in Outcast, I present the writings of Cornel West and Henry Louis Gates Jr. on black anti-Semitism as an opening for discussion with a left that regards itself as a vanguard in the fight against anti-black racism, while dismissing anti-Jewish racism in its ideological midst. In sum, Outcast is an endeavour for a solidarity that escapes the restrictions of race and other politicised identities which divide and exclude us, and instead calls for a genuinely universal alliance for political and human emancipation. Now, I want to end this presentation prior to discussion with the audience with two thoughts on how Outcast potentially converses with other recent work on racism and anti-racism. In his book Multi-Racism, Rethinking Racism in Global Context, Alistair Bonnet also points out the consequence of framing the study of racism in the black and white terms of a United States context, such that, I quote, anti-black racism is made visible at the cost of the invisibility of other racisms, both from other parts of the world and from within Europe, including the Holocaust. What Bonnet coins the Western racism paradigm, which dominates ethnic and racial studies, prevents a study of racism that is genuinely international by ignoring, downplaying and denying what are in actuality, he notes, cross-hatching and intermingling sites of modern racism in most of the world. He proposes a focus on plural racisms and plural modernities. Now, this brings to mind the work of Isabella Taborowski on the reworking of the protocols of the Elders of Zion by Zionologists in Stalinist Russia into a Marxist critique of Zionism for the Communist Party bureaucracy and a wider global left audience. This work does precisely what Bonnet calls for by exploring the cross-hatching and intermingling sites of modern racism. Another potential interlocution of Outcast is with Kenan Malik's book Not So Black and White. To his credit, his work is also an effort at reintegrating anti-Jewish racism into an understanding of racism more generally. But he does something quite odd following his chapter, The Reinvention of Jew Hate, in a chapter titled Barbarism Comes Home. He applies the idea of the imperial boomerang. I quote, "The truth that Europeans have to face about Nazism," the Martinique poet and statesman Aimé Césaire wrote, "is that before they were its victims, they were its accomplices. That they tolerated that Nazism before it was inflicted on them, that they absolved it, shut their eyes to it, legitimised it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European peoples." In this idea of the imperial boomerang, the Holocaust is seen as the product of blowback, an inevitable and familiar horror inflicted on white bodies as a result of the horrors which white bodies have inflicted on black bodies. In the words of the academic Kahinda Andrews, we see very clearly with the Nazis the boomerang effect, where racism, fascism, the logic of white supremacy comes into Europe and becomes enacted on white bodies, and everyone turns around and goes, wow, this was a really bad idea. Now, similar to much of the left's obsession with the blowback thesis after 9/11, which, by fixating on the crimes of US imperialism, neglected any critique of the politics of Islamism, the idea of imperial boomerang, as it's applied to the Holocaust, neglects the deep history of representation and persecution against the Jewish other. And it seems to me the imperial boomerang falls within a colonial model of racism and once again banishes anti-Jewish racism.